Welcome to the Branson Legacy Sabbath School. We continue today to hear from Oleksandr Dubov, who is the most recent member of the School of Religion faculty. He specializes in healthcare ethics. He's already making a very significant contribution to that discipline. Those who were here last time enjoyed it greatly. I think watching those people climb the stairs on keys of the piano and how that encouraged them to use the stairs. There was another illustration that I thought was very profound from one of the restrooms where, in the Netherlands, we won't discuss that further, but if you want to hear about it, look on the YouTube, because actually it's quite impressive what was done there. So we're glad again that Olex is here, and we will begin with prayer. Dear God, again, we are thankful for this Sabbath school. We are thankful for the memory of Roy Branson, and we are thankful for what we are going to hear from Alex this morning. In Christ's name, amen.
Good morning. I wanted to continue conversation today, and I wanted to talk about a few things. So the last time we talked about behavioral economics and the role of persuasion and different ways in which we can nudge people. And so I don't know if you remember about the conversation about nudges. It's a way of helping people basically make better decisions for themselves, just kind of to rehearse, by not taking any options away and creating a context in which they make choices to steer them to better choices. For example, I talked about example in cafeteria, where if you want people to eat healthier, you would place healthier foods in the front, and less healthy foods in the back of the line, and so obviously that will result in better choices. Or there are a couple of other examples of nudges we discussed, like nudging organ donations, where we manipulated default option, and when people go to DMV now, default is check this box if you want to become an organ donor. People don't check it, but there are many countries where the default is switched, and the question is asked, please check this box if you don't want to be an organ donor. So people don't check this box, but then they still join the program. So we talked about different ways in which we can nudge people, and some about ethics of that. And there was one question that I kind of wanted to follow up, and my apologies, this presentation is a collection of different thoughts and presentations in one. But I wanted, before going to the next topic, I wanted to talk briefly about persuasion and how is it different from manipulation or coercion. Because after the presentation, there were a couple of questions related to whether it's use of nudges or persuasion, or is it coercive, is it manipulation. So I wanted to, before going to the next topic, to discuss the difference between persuasion, manipulation, and coercion, and what would be some conceptual differences. So what is persuasion? There are many definitions. When I tried to look up this topic, and when I thought about the topic of persuasion, it was interesting to see there are so many different definitions of what it means to persuade people. So one example of persuasion, like one definition of persuasion, focuses on communication. So persuasion is a human communication designed to influence others by clarifying their beliefs, values, or attitudes. Some other definitions of persuasion focus on intentional acts. So it's a conscious attempt by an individual to change the attitudes, beliefs, or behavior of another individual or a group of individuals through the transmission of some message. So it's a very intentional act. Some other definitions highlight the role of perception. So persuasion is a symbolic activity whose purpose is to affect the internalization or voluntary acceptance of cognitive states or patterns of overt behavior to exchange your messages. So the role of perception is very important. And also role of voluntariness, so it should be voluntarily act. Successful intentional efforts at influencing another mental state through a communication in which the persuadee has some measure of freedom. So freedom is very important. So if you want to persuade somebody, there should be some sort of freedom. There was one example when I wrote about this topic I gave, but I thought also about another one. I'm not going to use this one. Imagine a burning building. Actually, when I was writing this, I was at Yale, and I ended up being in a burning building. There was fire in the complex where I lived, so we had to be evacuated, and I couldn't. I remember running downstairs, and there was so much smoke that we couldn't get through the smoke, so I had to run up the stairs, and we got stuck on somebody's balcony, and we were thinking about what's going to happen. Are they going to, firemen actually came, and they were taking some people from the balconies. We were wondering, should we jump down? So it was a little bit of a scary moment, and actually, so it was a big fire. And thinking about this topic of persuasion, I was thinking about imagining a woman who, in a similar situation, and she is stuck on a balcony of a burning building, and the only way is for her to jump. And but she's afraid, obviously, and she's very hesitant to jump down. And so, what will be the persuasion in this case? To persuade her, first of all, there should be some intentionality, right? It should be intentional act. And if you say something like, I unintentionally persuaded her to jump down, it doesn't really make sense, so it has to be intentional. Or I persuaded her to jump, but failed. Also doesn't really make sense. You can persuade somebody without having a clear intent to do so. Also, there should be some room for freedom. So if somebody would come behind her and just push her down, that would not count as persuasion, right? So there should be some sort of freedom of voluntariness in what's happening. And one of the most important things, I think, it's so the communication is also crucial. And some people somehow assume that persuasion is only logical. So logical appeals or logical information is enough to persuade somebody. Only if I'll present somebody facts of the matter, if I'll describe the situation in the right way, that will be enough to persuade somebody. But in her case, if firemen would try to explain her that she's in danger, that probably still not going to be enough. So that will not be enough to persuade her. In order for persuasion to be effective, they may appeal to her emotional state. They may remind her about her kids and how much her kids need for her to be alive, and her other relatives, and that there's still some people she should care about, and that's why she needs to jump. So they may appeal to her emotions just as much as to her logic, even though somehow, when we talk about persuasion, we always assume that's only logical appeal with providing a lot of information, which is not necessarily the case. So the communication is crucial, and in order for persuasion to happen, we often may have to influence somebody's feelings just as much as we influence their logical state in order to succeed. So that's kind of the definition of persuasion I came up with. So persuasion is a form of influence when one person intends to produce a change in the behavior or opinions of another using words to convey information, feelings, or reasoning, or a combination thereof, while leaving enough freedom to choose otherwise. So that's kind of the definition of persuasion that I always use. And so it's important to ask, whether coercion, since we talked last time about different nudges and how to nudge people, and it's probably important to make the distinction between manipulation, coercion, and persuasion, because nudges, in a way, they're persuasive, but they may not be manipulative or coercive. So, do you think coercion equals persuasion? Are those two things the same because both seek to influence people, both seek to produce change in people's behavior. So would you agree that that's the same thing? Coercion, persuasion. So it's probably not. So coercion usually there is assumption of compliance. When you coercive to somebody, you assume that the other person will comply. You often use some sort of trickery or force, and there is intent to harm. Coercive influence has negative connotation. There is some sort of harmful effect, and the choice is constrained. Versus when we talk about persuasion, there is no threat. It's not a threat for dreadful influence. There is often a positive result. There is no willingness to harm, and no constrained choice. It leaves room for freedom. Coercion is also probably not equal to manipulation. There are two different things as well. So in coercion, a victim knowingly acts against his or her will, but in the manipulation, a victim falsely believes that she is acting in accordance to her will, but that may not be necessarily the case. So in coercive influence, there is always a threat that cannot be resisted by somebody, but in manipulation, there is an influence that can be resisted, although it's not. So that's the manipulation. There is also a difference between persuasion and manipulation. So persuasion, there should be some sort of trusting relationship based on mutual respect and interest, but manipulation often objectifies people. There is no relationship, there is no trust and respect in manipulation, because in order to manipulate somebody, you have to objectify them and not really care about their well-being. So that's probably the difference between manipulation. Manipulation also creates illusion of free choice in order to lure somebody into a decision that would probably be resisted otherwise under normal circumstances. But persuasion is a positive force used to produce positive outcomes by fostering somebody's choice. So that's probably why it's important when we talked, just to clarify, when we talked about different modes of persuasion in healthcare last time, we talked about ethics. And when we talk about persuasion, probably it's important to make difference between persuasion, manipulation, and coercion, and how these three modes of influence people are different. So when last time I mentioned that, especially in healthcare, we somehow providers don't like to think about themselves as persuaders or that they persuade people. But if you remember last time we talked that oftentimes they do, even when they describe different options. For example, when there is a choice between surgical procedure and medical procedure or treatment, if you start with a surgical procedure versus medical, that in itself will influence choices because it will anchor somebody's choice and result in preference for surgical if you start with that option. If you describe risks of the procedure in terms of numbers saved versus numbers lost, like for example, if you say 95 people survive this procedure, or if you say the same thing but you say 5 people die from this, the choice will be very different. People in one condition, they often choose the treatment. Another, when you say 5 people die from this procedure, there are more people who will say, no, I don't want this, even though it's exactly the same information. So in a way, we do influence people often, and it's important to think about ourselves in healthcare or even in other areas of life as ones who have influence over people, and how we present choices, how we communicate has impact on decision making. So persuasion can be a positive device. It's not necessarily, we should think about it as a negative force, because it's different from manipulation or coercion. And as I mentioned, logic alone may not enough to persuade people. So in an example of burning building or example medical situations, people may still have ability to understand the facts, but they may not be, that will not help them to make a decision. When you appeal to emotional states, when you appeal to their emotions, that may help them to read the situation more reasonably. So to persuade somebody means to awaken in this person desire towards a particular course of action. So it's not deception, so persuasion as a force, it's not deceptive, but it's helping somebody to see truth in a better way. So that's just a few clarifications based on the last presentation, how's it different persuasion, manipulation, or coercion. But today I wanted to talk about in-group versus out-group dynamics from psychology and how it may be relative or relevant for us in the church. And this, I started to think about it after a few conversations we had around the table with other faculty when we were lamenting that sometimes when you present facts to somebody who's very well educated, it's still not enough to help them see situation differently or change their beliefs when it comes to things like women ordination or some other contested issues in the church. We sometimes wonder why when we present clear facts and logical information, and when it's so clear and so like there's so much evidence for one's position, sometimes people who are very well educated, they still refuse to see the logic or to see the to hear the position and kind of consider facts reasonably logically. So why this happens, and that kind of started to or made me think about the dynamic in psychology that talks about in-group versus out-group dynamic or bias. And so the social identity of somebody. And it reminded me of this joke. There was an old man who was a very passionate fan of football club or football team. And when his doctor told him that he was about to die, he canceled his season tickets and became a fan of another club, his old club's worst and most hated rival. And when asked why he changed his clubs just before you die, he said, well, better one of them dying than one of us. So this kind of just an example of how group behavior matters to people, and how people really strongly identify with one group, and that influences somebody's identity. And we derive our social identity from our identification with one specific particular group. So this concept of social identity, I thought about it, is a part of individual self-concept, the way we see ourselves, and it derived from the knowledge of membership of a specific particular group to which we belong, and the emotional significance that we attach to this membership. It can be different memberships. So it can be football club, or it can be political membership, conservative versus liberal. It can be within the church. It can be also conservative versus liberal, or so people sometimes attach a lot of emotional value to a particular group they belong, and they see themselves as a part of this group. And thinking about it, it also made me think about prejudices. And so there's often this assumption that only ignorant people have, or evil people have prejudices. There is this famous saying by Hazlitt who said, prejudice is a child of ignorance. But I wanted to, in this presentation, also to kind of convince that it's not necessarily the case. Prejudices or stereotypes are very natural, and if you look at me, probably you can have a lot of stereotypes or some things that you can know about me without even knowing me. You can probably guess my political orientation or affiliation. You can guess where I'm from. You can obviously see that I'm white, and so there are a lot of assumptions we can make about me, and most of the times they will be probably correct. Even sometimes it was so interesting. People often assume that I'm German. And I was often surprised at why. I had cases when people, even on the street, they would come and talk to me in German. And I was like, I don't speak German. But surprisingly, I just recently done 23andMe a genetic test, and surprisingly, I have some German heritage without me even knowing that. So even that assumption that I thought is false is probably not necessarily false in itself. I was surprised to see my genetic heritage. So we do have a lot of stereotypes, and stereotypes are very useful in our daily life because in order to understand the world, we need to categorize things into specific categories. The way we see the world, we see it in categories, and we place different things into different categories. And so that's the way we navigate through this world. So it's not necessarily an arbitrary quirk of a mind, it's a part of the way we experience world through categorization. So we know that some things we can eat, some fruits we cannot eat. We know that there's different categories, and we always think in categories. What's thing belongs to which category? So the same way we think about people. And so when it comes to bias, we often also it's a result of this categorization because we divide the world into us versus them, in-group versus out-group. Sometimes we can be ashamed of having these biases, but sometimes people are actually really proud to have them. This made me think about the recent election, and I was watching one of the debates. And in one debate, there was a question. I tried to remember if it was this election or a previous election, but there was a question somebody posed during the debate about foreign aid, basically saying that do we have an obligation to provide foreign aid to other people when we have so much need here in the United States? And the candidate said that very proudly that we have to think America first. And we have to think about, first as Americans, and there was so much cheer and applause for people being proud, this is us, this is our group, and we have to support us first versus them later on, So, so sometimes, we can be ashamed of in-group versus out-group or bias, but sometimes we actually very proud to have it, thinking about us first versus them. This theory started with in-group behavior versus out-group with Henry Tachwell. In 1990, he was born in 1990 and tried to study in Poland, where he was born, but he couldn't get into university in Poland because he was a Jew. So he had to move to France, where when the war started, he became a prisoner of. In a camp. He survived the Holocaust in a camp where he was imprisoned. And he started to think when he was reflecting later on this experience, he thought that the majority opinion about Holocaust at the time was wrong, the way people thought about Holocaust. So at the time, the prevalent idea was that Holocaust was just a tragic flaw on the part of some Germans. It's a genetic taint, it's some authoritarian personality. But Tachwell said that Holocaust is just the exaggeration of a normal psychological process we have that exists in every single one of us. So he thought it's a part of something more normal in general that we do on a regular basis. And in order to demonstrate it, he started to do studies with British adolescents. So he had a big group of adolescents, like 14 years old, I believe, kids, and he asked them a number of questions, almost like a test, different questions. And based on those questions, he said, well, I conclude from this inventory that part of you are Kandinsky lovers, like you love the artwork of Kandinsky. And for the other group, he said, well, you obviously, based on this questionnaire, you love Klee. Although, that was completely bogus. There was no difference, he just made up these categories. There was no difference between the two groups. But interestingly enough, when he told this to adolescents that there are two different groups, it made a lot of difference for them, even though it was completely bogus and arbitrary. When there was a question about money, when they were trying to divide money, when he would give money, so they would try to give money to the members of their own group, so like kind of donation or charity. And they were very interested in establishing difference between the two groups. For example, they would refuse money for their own group if by doing so they would hurt another group even more. So they were really trying to, to create more difference between these two groups, even though there was completely bogus difference. There was no difference between the two groups. And interestingly enough, this bias shows up very early, even in kids and babies. Paul Bloom from Yale, a researcher who does moral psychology, he has very interesting study where his group, they recruited a number of parents with babies, and so babies obviously love puppets, and they showed babies puppets with two food preferences. So one type of puppets, they loved green beans, and the other puppets, they would love graham crackers. And obviously kids love graham crackers, right? So, and so when there was a choice between puppets, kids preferred puppets that love graham crackers. They went for the puppet with the graham cracker preference, because the preference of the puppet is very similar to my own preference. But what was even worse or interesting, they actually loved puppets even more when that graham cracker puppet would punish green bean puppet. So they would, so they that just shows how strong is the this in-group preference in us, and like what being associated with something that looks like us, thinks like us, with similarity. And so in psychology, when we study difference, in-group versus out-group dynamic, psychologists are usually interested in three things. The process that leads to this in-group versus out-group dynamic, the different strategies people use to maintain their social identity, and how it influences beliefs, preferences, and behavior. So maybe I'll try to touch just a little bit on that. So groups to which people belong are very important for people. It's a source of pride and self-esteem, and they give us a sense of social identity. And in order to increase our self-image, in order to help us think better about ourselves, we often enhance the status of a group we belong to. For example, Ukraine is the best country in the world. I'm Ukrainian. I hear this a lot when I go to Ukraine. It's the best country. But we also can increase our self-image, the way we think about ourselves, by discriminating or holding prejudice against the other group. Russians are a bunch of losers. So that's also what I hear in Ukraine. So we tend to divide the world into us and them based on the process of social categorization. So we put people in different social categories or groups. So in the central hypothesis of this theory, that members of a group will seek to find negative aspects in the out-group to enhance their self-image, to enhance the way we think about ourselves. So Touchwell, who proposed this theory, he said that so that's a normal cognitive process, the tendency to group things together, and in doing so we tend to exaggerate two things: the difference between the groups and the similarities of people in the same group. So we exaggerate those two things greatly. And according to Touchwell, there are three mental processes involved in evaluating others as us or them. So in-group versus out-group. And they take place in a particular order. So social categorization, identification, and comparison. So we start with categorization. We categorize objects to understand them, identify them, so we place them in categories. And we define what appropriate behavior for a specific group or appropriate pattern of thinking. So we categorize things. Then we, social identification, we start to identify ourselves as belonging to a particular group. So we derive our self-esteem, and we see ourselves as a part of a group. And then other stage is comparison. Once we categorize ourselves, then we start to compare us with others to how we look. So why it's important? Because a couple of things. Because first of all, biases, when we think about them, they're very natural. They're not a result of ignorance or culture. It's a normal social process that we all have. We probably cannot survive without bias, because this is the way we experience the world. This is the way we know the world. And I thought that it's important to see a lot of conversations that happen in our church even as a part of this in-group or out-group dynamic, and not ideological differences. So sometimes we tend to see this, heated debates in groups to which we belong, and not necessarily so much so of ideological differences. Because that's always the question: why we can, when we present evidence that's so difficult to argue against, there is so much of clear evidence for example, climate change. Why people who are on opposite pole of, in the other group, they just refuse to see the mounting evidence that climate change is real. Why people, educated people who know a lot about science, for some reasons they just blind to evidence, for example, for climate change. This is an example, or in the church for women ordination, or for other issues. Why educated people just mute to this evidence? Sometimes it's not necessarily the ideology; it's in-group versus out-group behavior. And talking about that, I wanted to talk about motivated reasoning. How motivated reasoning can be motivated. And I love this cartoon. Let's look at the facts. It's definitely a conspiracy. Thinking about this in-group or out-group dynamic, I came across, and I actually know one other Yale researcher. His name is Dan Cahan. He's actually a law professor, but he also does a lot of psychology work. And they started, his group started to think about this question: why isn't good evidence more effective in resolving political debates about climate change, or why the evidence is not effective? Why doesn't the mountain prove that climate change, for example, is real? Persuade more skeptics. Why it's not necessarily enough to persuade somebody? So the normal assumption is that public doesn't really know enough about science to judge the debate. So it's just basically ignorance. People are really ignorant. They cannot really understand the science. If they would understand the science better, they would judge the debate differently. They would actually, accept the other points. But Cahan and his group proposed that people may not be necessarily held back by the lack of knowledge. Probably the reason they look for facts for other reasons that find the truth. Probably they're looking for facts to enhance their standing in their own community. So they're not necessarily looking for facts for the sake of truth or for the sake of true things, but they just trying to enhance their status in their own communities, and that's the reason why. And I thought that was very clever the way they tested this concept or this theory. So they took 1,000 Americans and they surveyed their first political views, and then they gave them standard tests to assess their math skills. So they gave a simple math task. Well, not necessarily simple. It was a task that you really had to stop and think and do calculations. Basically asking, here's this, skin rash cream. Calculate, how effective is the skin rash cream. So and they give numbers, for this many applications, this many successful, this many failures. So you had to really sit and calculate and do the math to figure out, whether actually it's a successful treatment for skin rash or not. So, people really had to do math to consider this. I guess that's the end of my presentation. So I'm sorry, I'll just pull it up on my phone and I'll go from there. Sorry, you probably won't be able to see it on the screen. I don't know what happens. I'm very sorry. Just a second. So then what they've done later on, they showed them exactly the same problem, but instead of skin rash, they asked them about gun control and the measures of gun control. And they asked people, to do exactly the same calculation. So the numbers were exactly the same as the previous question about skin rash, but they instead of now people, instead of solving the skin rash cream issue, they were actually looking through the problem with involving gun control. And the funny thing that happened, how good people were at math stopped predicting how good they were actually in solving this problem. And actually it was even funnier, people who were actually good at math, they were very bad in solving the problem was related to gun control. So, for example, when a group who were liberal, they were given this problem calculating how effective were gun measures in preventing violence, and when the results were pointing, math results were pointing that gun control was not effective in solving the violence, they were not able to get through the task. They were not able to calculate because what they believed about gun control was going against what they saw in the task. And similar was exactly the same for conservative when they get the math problem with when they were presented with a similar problem, but the completely opposite, that gun control was very effective, they couldn't get through the problem. So, and the number was actually very interesting. So, just a second. I wish I have my presentation. People who were bad at maths, they had 25% less chance to, so 25% of them were not able to solve the problem. But people who were good at math, 45% were not able to get through the math problem. So, so interestingly, being good at math actually, made them even worse in reasoning through the problem. So, so the idea that if you're good in science, it will help you to understand the problem, and it's not necessarily true because it may actually help you to be on the completely opposite sides. And in another experiment, the same group, they gave an experiment talking about very famous scientists. They presented in bio to a group of people like this famous scientist, and they asked to evaluate how much of the expert was this scientist based on his credentials. And similar thing happened when people heard that the scientist actually his research supports climate change. About 70 to 80% of liberals said like, yes, he's actually expert in his own field. But and the similar thing happened to conservatives when they had this to evaluate the scientist, and they saw that his research disproves climate change. 50% or 60% of them said, yes, he's an expert. So so the way we see the facts, usually it's helps us to establish our role in the community, and it's and it has nothing to do with with objectivity or with the way we interpret the evidence. It has to do a lot with the way we see ourselves as a part of the community. And so Kahan calls this a motivated reasoning, when when our reason has ultimate goal and it drives our reasoning towards a specific goal that we have in mind. And it's important to consider, for example, consider Sean Hannity. If he would say tomorrow he would come to the conclusion that climate change is real, it's an important threat, what would happen to him? First, probably, people start to think it's a joke, but then later on, obviously his friends will betray him. The politicians will start speaking out against him. He would lose his job. He would lose a lot of his social support. So he would lose his base and people who actually were a fan of him. So changing your identity, it's a brutal process, and then that's why it's probably not surprising that people, when they see evidence that threatens their identity, they attack it in a very aggressive way, because it's something that really they mobilize their all intellectual artillery to destroy this evidence, that threatens their own personal identity that they derive from the social group they belong to. That's what they call identity protective cognition. And it was interesting also, there is another example where this identity protective cognition actually works, or how they were able to show it. It's a famous classical psychological experiment where in 1950s they showed videos to groups from Ivy League colleges. And in this group, in this video, referee was making calls about football match between these two rival universities. And obviously students from those two rival colleges, they judged referees' calls as fair and true when these calls were done in behalf of their own team, and they were actually very upset when they saw the referee making calls against their team. And so that basically shows how what they saw in that video was actually driven by this process of group process. What they were able to see was actually driven by this ultimate goal or end goal. So it was motivated cognition, motivated reasoning. They had the motivation in mind, and it directed their mental operations. It directed their vision, and directed what they saw and how they interpreted. So I think it's important, to thinking about this identity protective cognition when we have this interesting, difficult topics that discuss in the church or in any other, climate change or whatever, you name it. Some polarized topics, they really have to do less with the facts and more with social identity that derive from the belonging to a particular group. Other thing that I thought was very interesting related to this identity protective cognition is the notion of cognitive dualism. This notion was derived also from the same group. I was for a while part of this group with Dan Cahan. And so they looked at two things. They talked to a number of Muslim doctors, and they were very interested to see how Muslim doctors who they don't believe in evolution, but in their work, they really have to use concepts from evolutionary theory, for cancer research or you name it. So they were trying to understand how those two beliefs can coexist when, as a Muslim doctor, you really, don't believe in evolution, but then you have to use the concepts from this theory in your work. And they also looked at they actually done a number of studies with farmers, southern farmers. And when they surveyed farmers in the south, 50% or more said that, they don't believe in climate change. But then when they asked how much climate change is a threat to their farms, 70% said that it's a very significant threat, and they actually modify the crops pattern. They do provisions for climate change, even though they don't believe in climate change. And so they were trying to understand how these two things can coexist. They came up with this notion of cognitive dualism. The idea that, the one doctor explained very well, that, there is he said that I have two identities. One is identity of a Muslim believer, and one identity is of being a researcher, and those two identities, they don't intersect. I can go to work and have my identity as a researcher and do whatever, but when I go home, I'm a Muslim believer, and those two things never intersect, they never cross each other. Similar with farmers, and similar with many other things. So sometimes, we in psychology, sometimes we think it's a process of compartmentalization. You compartmentalize, those things in different compartments, but not necessarily true. Sometimes people can really have these two opposing beliefs without having them intersect. And when they're at work, they believe in one thing, but when they come home, it's very different. So that's another thing I wanted to talk about. Since I promised to also to touch on ethics, I also wanted to mention how, interestingly, this in-group versus out-group behavior, it's not only influence our way we think about things, but it also can influence our ethical behavior as well. And so I came across, and I know the researcher who's done a lot of studies on cheating, why people cheat. And the assumption in the cheating is that when you cheat is because probably it's only like a few rotten apples. It's not majority of people don't cheat, it's just like a few bad people who, like in my classroom, when I look at my students, I would assume that there are only maybe one or two who potentially can cheat, otherwise everybody is very honest. But what they found in the cheating actually was very interesting. It's not necessarily true. They've done a very big experiment involving 40,000 students. and they gave them 20 math problems, but they gave them not enough time to solve the math problems. They gave only 5 minutes. And they said, we're going to pay you for $1 per each task you're able to solve. So as many tasks as you can solve, that's how much you're going to get paid. So when 5 minutes were up, they asked students to bring their tests, and they had a shredder. So they said, shred your papers and tell me how many problems you were able to solve. So students usually said 6 or 7 problems, that's the answer. But what was interesting about the shredder only shreds sides of the paper. The body of the paper was intact. So they could actually see the real number of solved problems. So really, students saw only 4 problems on average, but they reported 6 or 7. And what was interesting, their assumption was that maybe it's only like a few rotten apples. There are only out of 40,000 people, only 200 were big cheaters who said I solved 20 problems. But 70% of students said that they solved a little bit more. They only the cheating margin was very small, so they only cheated by 1 or 2 problems, right? So they said 1 or 2. And in economic theory, cheating is it's a very simple calculation. How much punishment am I going to get if I'm going to get caught? How much reward I will get if from cheating, and what's the probability of being caught? And you weigh those 3 things, and you decide whether should you or should you not cheat. But interestingly, this economic theory didn't work really in the cheating behavior. So when students, they tried to modify, for example, they increased number of money they paid for true answer for $5, $10, and the result was exactly the same. They only cheated. It didn't increase cheating. It increased cheating. There was same amounts. 70% of people cheated, but only by a little bit. And also they modified probability of being caught. They said shred only half of the paper and give it to me, or shred it complete or throw it away, and tell me. So they modified the way how much chance actually students think that there is to be caught, and it was they still cheating pattern was exactly the same. But what was interesting, the only modification that doubled the cheating was when they give people tokens. They said instead of dollars, I'll give you tokens, and you can go 12 feet outside of the room and exchange it for dollars. At double cheating. Probably because it's kind of similar what happens at the workplace. It's easy to take a pencil from a workplace, but you wouldn't take $1 from petty cash money, right? But it's so easy to when it's not necessarily the money thing. Also how it's related to in-group versus out-group behavior. It was another modification of this experiment, and it's done in Pittsburgh, and where I studied. And in Pittsburgh, there are 2 schools, kind of rivalry schools, Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh. And they've done exactly similar experiment, but they hired one paid actor who, after a minute of this test, he stood up and he said, I'm done with the test, and I've done all the 20 problems. And the examiner said, oh, okay, here's your $20 and you can go home. What was interesting, very interesting, there was a very big difference in the way students responded to this cheater, right? Because it signaled, that they can't cheat. There was a signal behavior you're not going to get caught. Somebody just cheated in front of you, and obviously openly, and it's nothing happened. But students never cheated if, for example, they were Carnegie Mellon students, and the person who stood up and said this was from University of Pittsburgh. They modified their T-shirt, what was written on their T-shirt. So if the person who cheated stood up and said, I'm done with the test, but he had University of Pittsburgh T-shirt, I'm Carnegie Mellon students. Nobody in the room cheated because those heathens, those horrible people, they cheat. Our group never cheat. So it's influenced behavior. Versus when somebody from Carnegie Mellon stood up with the Carnegie Mellon T-shirt and he said, "I'm done," and that was a bunch of Carnegie Mellon students, that increased cheating behavior because in our group, that's kind of normal. So that's one of those applications, in group versus out group to ethics and ethical behavior, how it happens. in real life. And there are also, I can talk about not only ethical behaviors, not only cheating, but also pro-social behavior, our altruism, altruistic donations, or the way we help other people, also related to this in-group versus out-group bias. We really tend to help more or to donate more to people who we believe are part of our own group. There was an interesting experiment done in Poland where religion is very important, and they've done same experiments, with people who are on the tram, passengers, and people in the supermarket. And people on the tram, there were three different scenarios. Same person, or she would come into tram on crutches. Lady, on crutches, but the modification was in one scenario she was dressed as a nun. Another scenario she was dressed as a Muslim with a hijab. And another scenario, she was dressed as an atheist, she was wearing, black makeup and, like a God crossed, t-shirts and, so it was obviously, she was like a punk atheist kind of person. And they tried to see how often or how fast people would help this person on crutches, give her seats or help, and obviously people very, very fast, they responded to none, and, she was seated right away, and there were more people who gave up their seats. Obviously atheists probably didn't really get a lot of office seats, to sit down. And they done the same behavior, the same experiments in a supermarket queue, but in line when people were waiting. There was a person who was acting as if he was jumping the line, like going in front of the people. But they also done the same modification. In one instance, he was dressed as a priest, or like some sort of. In one instance, he was dressed as a Jew, with a skull cap. And in another, he was just dressed as a regular person. And then they asked people in the queue how much they were upset about, this behavior. How, and people were very upset when the Jew was jumping the queue. They were, but they were less upset when it happened with us. So the way we judge behavior, the way our pro-social behavior goes, or there are many studies about donations for altruistic causes. It's often happens, to enhance our status in the community, or we judge it based on who we believe belongs to our group versus other group, us versus them kind of behavior. So that's just a couple of things to show how in-group bias works, how it can motivate our reason, and sometimes why people are immune to logic or facts. It's not necessarily because they don't understand the facts, but it's because of this result of in-group versus out-group bias, and how it can influence our social behavior or ethical behavior, many other things. So now apologies for some reason the presentation stopped in the middle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex. Questions? I see one over here. It's going to make me walk all the way across.
Coercion and persuasion, to me, is mind control or behavior.
That's influence, yes.
Do you think that human wisdom is powerless?
No, it's not powerless, but it can be powerless in some instances. Like the example of the burning building, right, where the lady needs to jump. If we'll give her reasons and facts, she may still not jump. We may fail to persuade her, right? Sometimes the way to persuade people is to influence their emotion just as much as their logic or their way of thinking. So in some instances, facts alone or reason alone may not be enough.
Talking about manipulation and coercion. In our spiritual lives, when the Spirit of God is influencing our decisions, or I think Isaiah is calling that small voice that is behind us and telling us what to do, what to choose, in what category would you include that?
Oh, it's probably persuasion, because we're still free to choose otherwise. But there are many instances in the scripture that like God not only appeals, to reason alone, you can also, see where he, uses a lot of beautiful metaphors of, my people, chosen people, like, for example, when he persuades Israelites, and appeals to the sense of, of belonging, or the sense of, emotional states, not necessarily only, this is the right way, right? There are so many instances in the Bible where when God persuades, he persuades not only, wisdom and logic alone, but, beautiful appeals, in Isaiah, where you read about, my beloved people, why.
When you're persuading somebody, you must assume that they're thinking straight. What if a person is drunk or sick or an addict? How do you persuade them to do something when you know they're really not thinking straight? When you're talking to a patient and they're scared or talking from a different place, that they have all their wits about them. They may not.
Right. But sometimes, when they, in that kind of state, that's they in agitated emotional state. So the usually first thing they do, instead of reasoning them out, you calm them down emotionally, probably, or make sure that they're in the right emotional state first before you persuade them to do something. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it's impossible, especially for addict or drunk person.
So what do you do? You force them to do something?
Well, it depends. Yeah, sometimes sometimes in the healthcare we do, and sometimes force them. But it's only when you can really show that that capacity for decision making is not there. So but there is the whole process. You really have to be sure that the capacity is not there to make a decision.
As a clinician, I found applying ethical considerations quite easy within the Adventist fraternity of institutions. When I got into the business arm, it was very, very different. And so for 20 years, I was a lead negotiator, mediator for Adventist organizations, including Loma. I saw every kind of behavior at the negotiating table that you can imagine. We were all over the place. Cognitive dualism was active every day, and in my effort to try and get some ethical guidelines, both Adventist Health and Loma were very reluctant to provide training for my people. Most of them non-Adventists who were coming to me, I couldn't hire Adventists because they don't make good negotiators. They're reticent. They don't want to be aggressive, you see. So I often had to find a non-Adventist who wanted to be good witnesses and good ambassadors to the Loma organization and to Adventist Health, but needed guidelines. And so I'm wondering, do you provide an education service today to the business arms of Loma or an Adventist organization, or are you just focused on bioethics and the kind of behavioral ethics that you're talking about today? Because I've been involved in a lot of strategic planning. Mission and visions was easy. You get the values. Risk management says, no, be careful putting something down on paper. We're going to get nailed for that. And others said, no, we have different values. We can't describe them. We can't put them down. And so this is very confusing to our audiences, who then learn how to play us because we don't have declared values. I could go on and on about this, but my point here is, are you going to provide support, or does your department provide support to the business units? Because business ethics from a Christian university is a huge, huge issue because they have expectations for us. And I often walked out of meetings having to call up people and apologizing for certain behaviors at the table, or walking out thinking we aren't the people that we say they are. We're not only not the people we say we aren't even the people we think we are. That's how deep it often goes. Those are my frustrations. They're my points to you. If you don't, please provide and offer some counseling to some of the business units who really need it.
Right, and actually a lot of this comes from negotiation strategies. Like one professor who I studied with doing this, he actually asked the negotiator. But I think we do have, I know personally of one class, and actually I already had a chance to present for MBA students. So we, at least there is one class I know of where we, but probably it's important to be more intentional with MBA students. Provide them, some training and guidance in this.
Mm-hmm.
questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Our time is up. You'll stay by and people will question. By the way, I also understand that people believe they're being watched. They're much more honest.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would just say this time of year, as we get into our income tax, don't play the audit lottery because you will get caught. Okay. Let's do our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.